Hello and welcome to this, the 200th episode of Backlisted, the podcast which continues to give new life to old books. Something a little different today. We're actually, for the first time ever, being filmed live. It's not live for you, but it will be live when you see it. Anyway.
Okay.
Shall I do that again?
No, we'll get the hang of that.
That's good.
fine.
I liked it.
Okay. Today, you find us in the basement of a late Victorian house in the West London suburb of Ealing, sometime in the late 1950s. It's a very neat room, with a long woodworking bench, a desk, and a drawing board, and a strong smell of sawdust. An extractor fan purrs gently above the bench, and a short, slightly overweight man sits at the desk, examining a copper box. Beside him stands a tall man in a naval overcoat, looking in admiration at the box and its contents. I'm John Mitchinson, the publisher of Unbound, where people crowdfund the books they really want to read.
And I'm Andy Miller, the author of The Year of Reading Dangerously. And for this special show, our 200th, we have invited a special guest. It's the 200-year-old Richard Osman.
Welcome, Richard.
Hello, gentlemen. How lovely to be here.
It's so nice to see you. Richard is a producer, comedian, television presenter, and best-selling author. And when we say best-selling author, John, we mean best-selling author. We don't mean better than some other folks or selling author. We mean best-selling author.
Top of the tree.
As a producer at Endemol, he worked on classic shows such as Deal or No Deal and 8 out of 10 Cats. But it was his own creation, Pointless, that saw him step out of a behind-the-scenes role to become a household name. As co-presenter with his friend Alexander Armstrong, he appeared in 1,300 episodes.
I think it's 2,000.
No!
I think it's 2,000. I don't know where that's from, but it's... Oh, I wish it had only been 1,300. The time I would have had back.
Incredible.
It's a lot, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
30
200.
series, something like that.
Yeah, so it was a lot.
Let's just pretend this isn't the 200th one, because suddenly it seems puny. It's pathetic.
Only 1,800 to go, gent.
Yeah. He left that role in early 2022 so he could spend more time on his writing, a theme we will return to in the main body of the show. In Richard's case, this proved a smart move. Beginning with the Thursday Murder Club in 2020, Richard's series of crime novels has torn up the record books. His debut novel was the fastest-selling debut crime novel of all time, and the first debut crime novel to be a UK Christmas #1. All 4 books have been bestsellers both here and in the US, and Richard's books have now spent I'm not laughing at you, I'm laughing in delight with you.
Honestly, if I hadn't heard of me, I would hate me. That sounds awful. I am sorry.
They've spent an astonishing 57 weeks in the UK #1 spot and sold over 10 million copies globally. Wow. His latest novel, The Last Devil to Die, published in September by Viking in the UK and Pamela Dorman Books in the US, sold 146,919 in the UK. You must have been disappointed to not get the 20.
I would have loved to get 147,000. That was the...
Making it the fastest selling British hardback novel of all
time.
Richard greeted the news saying he needed to sit down. And so there you
Here
go.
I am.
Take it easy. Take it easy.
Fine, it's the first time I've sat down since.
And given it's our 200th episode, before we plunge into the main show, we'd love to take this opportunity to ask you a few questions about your own relationship with books and reading. Given that you will have changed the course of popular literary entertainment in this country, in the States, and jacket design. I can't help noticing, I keep seeing books that look rather like yours on the bookshelves.
Yes.
How does that feel?
Well, it's a guy called Richard Bravery who did this cover. And funnily enough, we're doing the cover. I've got a new series coming out next year, and we're coming up with cover designs for that, and that's a lot of fun because essentially Richard is doing the next thing that people can copy. That's what we're
amazing. So that's a completely new, not the Thursday Murder Club
not
characters
the
at all.
Thursday Murder Club. They will be coming back, but yeah, a whole new series with a whole new look. Which I think will be equally iconic because we're ripping off something else equally iconic.
As in time-honoured fashion.
Yeah.
Hall of Mirrors.
Yeah.
Right, Hall of Mirrors.
Publishing.
Derivative with a twist. TM, Don Draper. So, Richard, I feel you must have grown up in a bookish house.
No, not at all, funnily enough. And, my brother is a great deal more bookish than me. The books we had, my mum had some Agatha Christie. There was like Judith Krantz and Harold Robbins, that sort of thing. But no, not really. We didn't. And I have very, very bad eyesight, so it took me a long time to start reading. When I was a kid, I would read a lot. Read Famous Five and all that because the font is quite big in kids' books. And as soon as you get onto actual books, it's like, oh, I can't read this, so I'll watch TV instead.
And there wasn't really an option, wasn't a sort of audiobook option in those days, really?
Exactly, yeah. You absolutely couldn't listen to it. And, as I got older, I thought, this is just, you're just going to take a long time to read books. But it took me a long time to get, because I couldn't read at the speed other people were reading, and so I couldn't quite work out how they were enjoying this experience as much as I was, because it was quite hard work for me.
That's fascinating, yeah.
Richard, your elder brother Matt,
Yes.
also a novelist, plays bass in a group called Suede.
He sure does.
Now, you and Suede all came from, as you say, like a dormy town in Sussex, right?
Yeah.
Near Haywards Heath.
In Haywards Heath.
In Haywards Heath.
Suburban, you say?
Suburban. We always like that.
You could not be more suburban. It's like a suburb of a suburb.
But the things, I thought of something I can remember Brett Anderson, the singer of Suede, saying in an interview back in the 90s, where he said, we're from the suburbs, but the thing is, all the good stuff comes from the suburbs. Punk, glam, acid house, techno. What's the city ever given us? Acid jazz. He said.
He's right, though, isn't he?
Yeah.
And now Brett was from Linfield, which is a suburb of Haywards Heath. There you go.
The chip on his shoulder is immense.
Exactly. But it's true, because, I think an awful lot of people will do anything they can to get out. And Matt did and Brett did. That's not me. I like being in the suburbs. That's where I feel safe. That's where I feel comfortable. That's my Britain. So it's London that feels alien to me.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm just about.
Take me back to Croydon, everyone. Take me back to Croydon. Did Matt pass books on to you, or was his status as your older brother a guarantee that you'd go down different paths?
Yeah, and also I think he realised that wasn't what I was interested in. That music was his thing, so he'd pass music on to me. So I found Bowie through him, and Jesus and Mary Chain, and the Smiths, and all of those bands, and Suede would sort of rehearse upstairs. So any coolness I have in me, and I have about 3.7% coolness, right? And I really go to that well again and again and again. But it's the same well. That all comes from Matt. But yeah, I don't really remember him reading, but he must have done, because he's so insanely well read, and that can't just come from 20 onwards. But perhaps it did. Yeah, we weren't a bookish household.
That's very, very interesting. Before I ask you a once traditional question that we've now ditched on here,
moved, Andy, not ditched.
We've moved. That's true.
Listen, all formats have to adapt. You have to evolve. That's the thing.
It's like a shark moving forward.
Listeners, pay heed to what Richard said.
Honestly, Pointless, we changed the format so many times. It never quite worked.
I want to know. You're very generous in your the way you talk about books and other writers, and in fact, the thing that inspired us to ask you to come and join us on here for show 200 was you managed to put A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr, which was the subject of the very first episode of Backlisted 8 years ago. You managed to put it back into the bestseller charts.
Yeah, one of my proudest achievements. It is. It's great. I love it.
But tell us about that. Do you think? I mean, all right, you read it, you love it. Yeah. You think, okay, I could talk about this. Do you pause and think, no, I want to keep this for me?
God, no. It's reading is a joy, and the one thing about being an author as well, the one thing that keeps me sane as an author, is understanding I'm part of an industry. If I was just thinking I want to live or die on the quality of my work and being remembered and, the quality of my imagery, I think that's too hard. What I like is to finish the book and then suddenly you're part of a big gang, which is publishers, which is editors, which is bookshops, which is booksellers. And that's an industry that's sort of gone from strength to strength in the last 5 years, bookselling. And that to me is the ecosystem that I'm a part of. And that's what keeps me sane, is thinking, no, I'm just really one cog in that wheel, and every time I sell a book, a bookseller has sold a book as well. So everyone's getting their.
So it's like a community, right?
Exactly that.
Readers and writers.
And listen, there isn't a high street in Britain that isn't better without a bookshop in it, and there isn't a home in Britain which isn't better without another book in it. And so anytime I come across a book, I have mainstream tastes, and I always have done. Okay, that's where my TV stuff comes from. If I read a book like A Month in the Country that I think everybody will love, then I'm going to shout from the rooftops because it's a brilliant book, but that everyone will also love. And that's such a rare kind of, that Venn diagram. And that, there's that On Golden Hill by Francis Spufford.
Yeah, great.
I read recently. It's a brilliant book that everyone will love.
Yeah.
Life After Life, Kate Atkinson.
Yeah.
Brilliant book that everyone will love. So anytime I come across one of those, I'm like, I try and sing it from the rooftops, because you make the world a better place if you bring great books into people's lives.
I seem to remember, John, that one of the reasons that we wanted to do A Month in the Country early on, and in fact for the first episode, was because neither of us ever met anyone who didn't like that book if they'd heard of it.
Yeah,
that was the trick.
It's mad. It is mad, isn't it? Because I've given 2 copies away this week to people in the village, because we were having a discussion and people say, "Oh, I've sort of fallen out of reading," and then you suddenly think, "I know the entry level drug that will get you back onto reading."
If you want a great, really short book, then
and that's the thing. I mean, the shortness does help because people don't feel intimidated by it.
So, what have you been reading this week? That's what we used to ask one another. Now we're asking you. What have you been reading this week?
Okay, well, listen, I'm going to say something probably neither of you ever said. I am listening to, I think it's the 3rd book in a series, and I genuinely think this series is the funniest series of books ever written in the English language, and I will absolutely die on that hill.
You heard it here first, folks.
And it's the new Alan Partridge book.
Yes, we love them.
We've talked about them on this show
written by
several times.
Neil and Rob Gibbons.
Yes.
And all 3 books, from start to finish, the comedy comes from such crazy angles. It's like Total Football. It's like the Dutch in the 1970s.
I agree.
Jokes coming from places you don't expect jokes from. The audiobooks, I think, are amazing because you've got Coogan reading them as well. But the sheer quality and volume of jokes, of character stuff, of story, of bathos is... I mean, I find it genuinely mind-blowing. And if we took comedy seriously in this country, critically seriously, then these would be, we'd be singing from the rooftops about it.
I'm sure we talked about the Partridge books when Sarah Perry was on.
I think we did. She's a massive fan.
Yeah.
And we said we thought that they were the perfect Partridge vehicle, that he'd found the absolute kind of the sort of listening to him delivering them in that.
Yeah. Well, but also the Gibbonses are really good at. I take my hat off to them.
Yeah.
We all like observing publishing trends and making jokes about them.
Yeah.
But they are so good at spotting a walking memoir.
Yeah,
right? Or whatever the new one is, of building a lighthouse.
Yeah, building a lighthouse.
I think, Richard, what you're saying about Coogan's reading of them, what's so wonderful is they're very funny books to read on the page.
Yeah. Oh.
But the audiobooks, this is a mark of Steve Coogan's incredible talent. He doesn't just read them as Alan Partridge. He reads them and leaves the listener with the impression that Alan is terribly pleased to be doing something as prestigious as reading his own book.
Well,
right?
he's reading them as Alan Partridge reading Alan Partridge.
Yes, that is the absolute genius.
I mean, literally, at the very start of the first book, the page says acknowledgements, and it just says, at this time there is nobody I wish to acknowledge. I mean, come on.
That's so nice.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that would... How is that not sung from the rooftops as a great... Just a great work?
It is by us and many right-thinking people. I also say, funnily enough, this is germane to what we've got coming up in a future episode, but... I always am grateful when comedians and comic writers make those books so much better than they need to be.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%.
This is the thing. It's this idea that you said mainstream taste, or what used to be called middlebrow taste, as though this is kind of an undifferentiated lump of all the same quality. It's not. To write great mainstream comedy, to write great mainstream anything, takes as much skill, as much much practice, and as much time as it does to write, literature.
I mean, of course it does. Listen, we're going to get onto it in the book we're talking about today. There's similar issues there, but I think critically. There's a certain highbrow critic who's not capable of knowing why one mainstream novel sells and another doesn't, or one mainstream novel works and another doesn't. They don't have, it's not in their wheelhouse because they're using different criteria.
Yeah.
And so reading reviews of mainstream novels is very hard because it's not, especially if they're funny, they lose all ability to understand what they're reading.
Does not compute.
Yeah, it really doesn't.
I think you'll see this in the reviews.
It's a huge motivation for why we wanted to do this podcast. Is not because we particularly feel that we need to hold the mainstream the flag for mainstream literature, but because it's so rare to get any space where you can talk about what used to be called high and low culture, or whatever you want to call it, the spread of stuff, and to be able to discriminate, between those things, and to be able to have proper conversations about their value and the skill of the people who've written and put together is ridiculously rare.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to see what endures.
Yes.
And who endures and what writing, just go, okay, that was, as you say, things that when they're reviewed at the time and you read them now and you just go, oh no, this is the one that's, look at Barbara Pym or something like that. And, just think of the big male novelists who are writing at the same time who just sort of disappeared into the ether.
It's funny you should mention Barbara Pym, because I know how much you like Barbara Pym. I want to run my theory by you, Richard. And if you disagree with it, I'm going to ignore that, and I'm going to publish and be damned. Okay. So your novels, The Thursday Murder Club, The Man Who Died Twice, The Bullet That Missed, The Last Devil to Die.
Yep.
I read an interview where you said they were partly inspired by the A-Team. Yes.
I think I've reverse engineered that theory, but yeah, for sure.
What do you mean?
I think that having seen their success, I was trying to think, well, how on earth did that happen? And then I thought about how much I loved the A-Team when I was growing up.
But it's in your brain, isn't it?
It's a gang where everybody, whatever problem comes along, one of them has the solution.
Team of all talents.
A team of all talents, exactly.
Okay, so and that I'm not going to disagree with your reverse engineered theory, but I'm saying there's another book that no one on earth would have thought of crossing with the A-Team to create the best-selling books of the 21st century. And that novel is Barbara Pym's Quartet in Autumn.
Yes, lovely. Listen, I take that. Quartet in Autumn meets the A-Team. Yeah.
Yes.
I'll take that.
It's a winner.
But it's again, it's reverse engineered. that's for sure.
All criticism is reverse engineered.
But let's just pause and say Quartet in Autumn by Barbara Pym. First of all, because it's about a quartet of elderly people, as your novels are. But also, and it is kind of funny in a very, very, very dark way.
Brilliant waspish female characters.
Yeah, and wonderful. But as you say about the type of books we're talking about in today's episode, Barbara Pym actually went through a phase in her career where she couldn't get published because people assumed that she was just a little old lady writing about vicars.
And you read it now and you just think, how on earth did that happen? Yeah. But then, you look at Mick Herron, who was sort of out of sorts, and and then John Murray came in and republished him. How does Mick Herron not sell?
I mean,
when you read someone who can, like Barbara Pym or Mick Herron, who can write so beautifully.
I remember when they were seriously talking about dropping Ian Rankin. Because he just wasn't getting the figures. And then he wrote
Sir Ian Rankin.
And then they wrote.
Will Ian be pleased to hear you say that?
No, he knows.
I'm not sure.
He knows this. And then he wrote I think it was Black and Blue. There was one it was slightly bigger. He put more into it or something. I don't know. Nobody really knows what. Boom! Suddenly, and then you've got 6 books that he's already. The rest, as they say, is literary history.
Well, listen. Richard, we have a running joke on this show about publishers' use of the phrase master storyteller.
Yeah.
And yet, it seems fair to say on this episode 200, you, a master storyteller, have brought to the table perhaps the master storyteller of the 20th century, right? I mean, it's the perfect landing. John?
We love that. Let's put the listeners out of their misery and say what we're going to be talking about today, the main event. The book Richard has chosen is by, as Angie said, another best-selling British author. It is Trustee from the Toolroom by Nevil Shute, first published in 1960 by Heinemann, the last of Shute's best-selling sequence of 23 novels, and it was published posthumously. It tells the story of Keith Stewart, a working-class man with Scottish roots who lives modestly with his wife in the West London suburb of Ealing, suburbs there, and who makes ends meet by writing a how-to column in a popular magazine called Miniature Mechanic. After his sister and her husband are killed while sailing in the Pacific en route to a new life in Vancouver, Keith and his wife Katie adopt Janice, his 9-year-old niece. Keith is made trustee in the will and discovers that all his sister and brother-in-law's savings had been converted into diamonds to avoid the strict British rules over exporting currency. More of that later, I suspect. I know this doesn't sound...
No, as you're describing...
Don't switch off.
Don't switch off. This sounds like the weirdest book.
It really does.
It both is and it isn't, yes. Despite never having left the country before, Keith decides it is his duty to visit the site of the wreck on an atoll in the middle of the Pacific and try to recover the diamonds. To do this, with next to no money, he must discover new depths of courage and ingenuity, and most of the novel is an account of his extraordinary adventure. He is helped on his way by many different people. The crew of a commercial aircraft, a Jewish-American tycoon who's made his fortune in lumber, and most memorably by Jack Donnelly, a big-hearted, half-Polynesian sailor who crosses the vast distances of the Pacific in a boat he's built himself with little in the way of traditional navigational aids.
Now, this book may not be one of Nevil Shute's best-known novels. In fact, we were saying before we came on air, and I'm prepared to confess this, when Richard suggested it, I had never heard of it, and I now, having spent a week finding out more about it, I'm so ashamed of not knowing, because this is
right?
one of his best loved and was a huge bestseller.
Yeah.
It was one of the top bestsellers of 1960. It was a Book of the Month Club selection in the USA, albeit with a slightly lukewarm endorsement by, you've written here, the Richard Osman of his day. We've just said he's Nevil Shute. He can't be Nevil Shute and
Clifton Fadiman, no.
Clifton Fadiman.
But Clifton Fadiman. Imagine being a big radio personality and also a critic and also a novelist. Who does that now?
Wow.
Okay, well, anyway, this is what Clifton Fadiman, the
damning with fake praise, I think.
Fading Fadiman, who wrote that Trustee from the Toolroom was, quote, an exciting story, honestly conceived, even if devoid of much literary grace.
I'd take that. I'd have that on the front of my next one.
Beautiful. In any event, by 1972, the book's paperback jacket could boast that Shute had sold over 14 million novels.
Some to go, yeah.
And his work has remained in print ever since, with Vintage reissuing all 23 of them as recently as 2009. So, Richard, before we discuss all the things to do with this book, why Nevil Shute was so successful in his day and is so little read now, we think.
Yeah.
When did you first come across a book by Nevil Shute or hear the name Nevil Shute?
I guess, again, he was absolutely in the canon, so I suspect we had A Town Like Alice at home. So I'd seen the name, I knew the name, and then I read that in my 20s and On the Beach, which I think are the two that most people have read.
They're the two I'd read.
Yeah,
the two I'd read.
And I really enjoyed A Town Like Alice. I didn't love On the Beach, although it's got something. I having reread it, I preferred it than I used to, because I think I was expecting something else, and actually now I've reread it. I thought, I see what you're doing, Nev. And then I picked it. Honestly, if you'd asked me 2 months ago, I would have gone for Michael Frayn for this podcast. I would have gone for Towards the End of the Morning. But I read Trustee.
It's a wonderful book.
It's a wonderful book.
Mm-hmm.
I read Trustee from the Toolroom, and it's funny as a writer, because a bit of you does sometimes have to think, what sort of a writer am I?
Yeah.
What example from the past sort of most suits, who I think I am. And I read this book and I thought, well, that's the writer I'd like to be. I just thought it was extraordinary, and it was extraordinary for very, very unusual reasons. There is not a single sort of show-off bone in this guy's body. This whole book is he's literally trying to entertain you. He's got a story to tell you, which I think he weaves very, very beautifully. It's sort of like an introvert's adventure, which is a beautiful thing. And there's I have a lot of theories about jeopardy, which we can get to later, and jeopardy in fiction and jeopardy in film. And in this book, it's this sort of jeopardy, but there also isn't jeopardy.
The jeopardy isn't where you think it's going to be, is it? In the opening couple of chapters.
And there are no villains, particularly.
No.
And the truth is, everybody helps him. Everybody wants to help Keith all the way through, and that's to weave that into an adventure story, I think so powerful. And we were talking just now. There's a wonderful motif all the way through this book. So Keith, who is is very poorly paid guy who writes for Miniature Modeler. That's his thing, but can make anything, makes tiny little machines, but is very, very, very unassuming and genuinely unassuming. So he goes on this incredible odyssey, on kind of, and it's a 50s odyssey when aeroplanes were a big deal, and these big lumber yachts. Everywhere he goes in this unassuming way, he'll introduce himself, and every single engineer anywhere just goes, "Sorry, you're the Keith Stewart from Miniature Modeler."
Yeah.
And he goes, "Well, I suppose so." And he's a huge celebrity amongst people who make stuff, and it's just such a joy because you're cheering him on all the way through, and just to see who's going to help him now.
Yeah, because he is this kind of little pooterish figure, isn't he? With he's described in the early on in the book as having a greasy Mac and a floppy hat, and he's slightly overweight and pasty skinned,
like thousands of men walking through London.
Walking through London in 1958 or whenever it's set.
It's my we've said this often on this show, but it's my belief that all books are in fact books about books, right? Fundamentally, they're all books about books. And sure enough, when I started reading Trustee from the Toolroom, I thought, "Oh, Neville, you don't fool me. A little guy who lives in Ealing, like you did, in your house, like you did, who's working on miniature models." And I thought, because miniature modelling, that's a metaphor for the fictional process. It isn't.
No,
he liked making miniature models. Neville Shute. There's no subtext there. It's about the thing that he's interested in. And one of his theories was, if you write about something that interests you, which he partly explains some of the strange subject areas he wandered into in the course of his career, which we'll come on to. But if it animates you, you will write better on the page, and that will communicate itself to the reader.
Yeah, he also says, which is true, he said, "Look, I only have one job, and that's essentially to entertain, to tell a story." And he says, "So what I try and do is if I have new information, I try and get that across as well."
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because what he thinks he's giving us this engineering information, because there's quite detailed bits of engineering in this, and about the size
really
of
detailed
bores and stuff like that.
It's proper fan service. If you're interested, don't you feel at this stage in his career, I'm going to give the people who are interested in engineering quite a lot of engineering.
But the lovely thing is, this is in the 50s. This is just before the world changed forever.
Yeah.
So what you're actually reading is an extraordinary bit of history. And it feels, you watch The Repair Shop, and people love The Repair Shop because it's people who can make things and do things. And he's writing about this guy. And so he is, you realise, trying to give you modern technological information to his reader.
Yeah.
But we're reading it 70 years later, and we're reading this incredible portrait of a lost age because the writing is so beautiful. But I'll sit and read that stuff and imagine, his workshop. They talk about all the different machines he's got in. And it's lovely. It's like when authors write about flowers.
Yeah.
They go, "I was walking down the road and there's hollyhocks," and they go, "I don't care."
Yeah.
I genuinely don't care. But there's a thing. I'll read a tiny bit here, and he says. He called the front basement room his clean working room, and this was his machine shop. He had a 6-inch Herbert lathe for heavy work, a 3.5-inch Myford, and a Bowley watchmaker's lathe. He had a senior milling machine and a Boxford shaper, a large and small drill press, and a vast array of tools ready to hand. And you just think, great. I mean, that's like, I don't know what any of those things are, but I can, I'm back there in the 50s.
But we were saying earlier, weren't we, that the thing that I find so interesting about Nevil Shute is, an aeronautic engineer, tremendously interested in detail, covers a very peculiar range of topics in the course of his novels. He's something I absolutely love when I find a writer like this. These books shouldn't work.
Oh my God!
I've studied the rules. These shouldn't work. He's an engineer. Books don't work, and yet the storytelling is gripping. They command huge audiences, or rather commanded huge audiences in their day. Why? What is? I think we'll come back to this. So let's ask it for the first time.
Yes.
What's at the heart of a Nevil Shute novel? What is the thing? What is the kernel?
It's a terrific question, and I think it's a genuine love for an underdog, And if you can write with a genuine love for an underdog, rather than I've created an underdog character who I think the audience are going to like. I think he has genuine respect for this character, and we have genuine respect for the character. And that's the case in lots of his novels. The slightly kind of unseen person, the slightly kind of overlooked person, changes the world in one way or another.
An ordinary person does an extraordinary thing.
Yes, which is such a trope. But if you write it from your heart, then that's great. If you're a literary novelist saying, "Oh, I'm going to do a thing now about an ordinary person doing something extraordinary," you think, well, no, because your brain is not ordinary, your heart is not ordinary. Whereas Shute's brain, his writing brain, is very ordinary. His heart is clearly very ordinary, and he's just a great kind of prose stylist as well in his own way. So I think it's that he writes stories that no one else is writing.
Yeah.
Which I think is interesting, and he writes them in a way. He, as you say, he doesn't respect any of the rules. That's why I talk about Jeopardy. He doesn't do the thing of saying, "Oh my God, what's going to happen next?" He just has a different rhythm.
Jack, and Trustee, this book it shouldn't work because he basically tells you what the plot of the there's literally no surprise as to how the plot of the novel unfolds. What he makes you interested in is it's like an engineering problem, isn't it? Jewels on the other side of the world. I have no money. How am I going to get there? And the answer is through being yourself, through being kind of quite brave and pushing your limits and asking people for help, and then in finding yourself in ridiculously, outlandish situations that you're ill-equipped for. I love that thing where his wife says, "It's going to be quite hot. You must take your cricket blazer and flannels." Yeah. And the great joy of the book is his observation is so precise in each of the locations, whether he's on an aeroplane or he's on a ship. All the kind of detail is amazing.
And it's fascinating because he will describe the technical detail, and you realise that he's using the language he can understand, but you can fill in the gaps around him, which is he's in this extraordinary place. And so he's got stuff to focus on. They go from the snows of, refueling the aircraft in Vancouver down to the boiling sunshine. And he's always the same. He's seeking out the engineer, both places.
There's a couple of things I'd like to throw in here. The first thing is, in the light of what we've just been saying, this is what Shute himself said about what he felt were the criteria for a good novel.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
I think that the contents of a book are far more important than the style. An author should write as well as he is able to, because one of his jobs is to make his book easy to read.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. But no book will be successful, however good the writing, if the contents are trivial and not worth reading. It's pretty stern stuff.
Oh, that's a manifesto.
For this reason, it has always seemed to me to be important to go to great lengths to find new material, to search for new facts and for new ideas to present to the reader in the fiction form. An author should know something of the world outside the bedroom if his book is to be useful. Useful is the word at the end there, right?
Interesting, by the way, it says bedroom rather than outside the front room. It sounds like he's responding to a very specific question.
Yes, perhaps so. Perhaps so. The thing I would like to say in relation to that, which actually massively increased my respect for this particular novel, is that he writes this novel at the end of his life, when, to all intents and purposes, after his unhappiness at the circumstances of the filming of his novel On the Beach, he has a stroke, and he writes this novel in the last year of his life. He is not quite bedridden, in fact, but not far off. He has only written about 20% of it when he falls ill. So he has to do two things. Those descriptions, he can't travel.
Yeah.
So he has to ask people from these places in the world to send him as many postcards, photographed descriptions as they can, so he feels on top of it. And the second thing is, he dictated most of it.
Oh, really?
Did you know that?
No.
He dictated it into a tape machine and then worked off the typed up proofs.
Yeah.
And that really, I mean, that's not a fun way to to compose a novel.
I mean, there's no fun way to compose a novel, but that's a particularly unfun one.
Yeah, there's a brilliant bit where he's in Slide Rule, his autobiography, where he says when he gets a typewriter, that's what enables him to write fiction. He said, well, I think most people start off writing poetry, and I started doing that and then realised I wasn't very good at that. He said, but I found writing, the physical act of writing, quite difficult. But once I got a typewriter, he said, that was it. I kind of could just...
But also, it's a gadget, isn't it, a typewriter?
And he loves a machine.
So why don't we... Richard, I might ask you about your routine in a moment, but let's hear Nevil Shute's daughter, Heather, describing her father's writing routine.
He was a very, very methodical man. He would always get up around 7:30, have breakfast at 8:15. Then about 9 o'clock he would disappear into his study, and he would stay there until 1 o'clock, something like that. We lived on a farm in Australia, a couple of 100 acres. And he just loved to get along out onto the farm, and he'd just go and see that everything was doing all right, that the cattle were fine. And so were the pigs. He used to love to go and watch the pigs.
Now, John,
there you go.
We've got Croydon in and we've got pigs. Then.
Yeah, I know. But don't you love that? That writing was just one of the things that he did. He didn't make it his defining thing.
Well, he was slightly ashamed of being a novelist.
He said, if people ask me what I am, I'm an engineer. That's what I trained to be.
And he was a serious engineer.
I mean,
he was a real deal.
But he also believed that he had to. The reason why he's got the name Nevil Shute is he doesn't want his career as an engineer to be compromised by people finding out he's a best-selling novelist.
So his full name was Nevil Shute Norway.
Yeah. Richard, do you have a routine?
I sort of do. In that I'll write for like 2 hours at a time. That's about as far as my brain will allow. But in that, I'm not a procrastinator. The second I start, my fingers won't leave the keyboard, and 2 hours later, I'll be done. But I won't look at the internet. I won't, have the phone. But I try and write. I have quite short chapters, just because my attention span is quite short. So I try and write a chapter every day. That's what I try and do, just so I've got a beginning and a middle and an end to what I'm doing.
And, sorry, it's such a basic question, but it's fascinating you say that. If you write at that rate, do you know exactly where you're going, or do you try and leave some leeway in so you can allow some energy in?
It's all leeway, yeah. So I have a rough idea of where I might be headed, and I know what the next 3 scenes I'm going to write are. But halfway through one chapter, someone will walk in, and I'll go, "Oh, okay. My story has changed." Otherwise, I'd be so bored if I knew where I was going all the time.
Yes, what Lissa Evans describes as you mustn't over-plan, because otherwise you're just colouring in between the lines.
Well, I think so, which I get for some people works, right? So, and listen, it's really hard to write a book. So whatever works for you, you must do. But for me, I have to, the characters aren't real if they don't have a bit of agency. Yeah. And, to allow them agency, I can't have decided what's going to happen to them. They have to have some hand in that.
Well, in a twist, at this point, walking into the room is a word from our sponsors. So let's listen to that. So we were just talking about routines and Nevil's routine, pre-pig routine.
The background to this is we should talk about his extraordinary work on the airship, the R-100.
Yeah, amazing.
But he's doing that. And then, while all this was going on, I was writing my second published novel in the evenings, So Disdained. Again, I seem to have taken considerable pains over it. It took me 2 years to write, and all of it was written through twice over, some of it 3 times. I used to find that the story became fixed in the first writing. I do not think I ever altered a scene or the essentials of a piece of dialogue in a subsequent writing. A rewriting increased the length by about 10%. Love the precision. Awkward phrases and sentences were eliminated, and the general style of the writing was improved. Since the first writing probably took a year, one came to the chapter fresh in the rewriting, a year older, with a year past in which one had forgotten much of the detail. This undoubtedly helped in putting the thing into a better style. This great amount of rewriting does not seem to me necessary now. This is writing in 1954. With increasing experience, I find that I can say pretty well what I want to say the first time. Perhaps 30% of my later books have been rewritten. I rewrite the first chapter always as a matter of principle, since it is seldom in tune with the rest of the book. Good.
Yeah.
I do not seem to get into my stride till the first chapter is over. Love it.
Do you know what? As a writer
great.
myself, I love Nevil Shute.
Yeah, I know.
Because
Yeah.
writing books, as you say, is really hard
Yeah.
and is often the agony is much more to the fore than Neville suggests it might be.
Also, that thing, his daughter saying he liked to go and look at the pigs and the cattle, and he had lots of projects on the go, and then he was making his little machines, and he was, running businesses. It's a very odd autobiography, Slide Rule, because it only goes up to kind of, it's really before he's famous as a writer. But the precision with which he kind of writes about the jobs that he's done, and also the big crisis, I think, in his life, other than his brother dying in the trenches, which I think was a huge problem. He was very close to his brother. A bit like you, Richard. His brother was the literary one.
Yes.
Fred would have written some.
Yeah. Oh my
Fred
God,
would have written some really great.
That would have been much better. Yeah.
Well, actually, Richard, you said when you chose this, you said that your brother Matt, you'd said to him, "I've just read this great book, Trustee from the Toolroom. It's about this," blah, blah, blah. And he said to you, let's give recognition to the sort of thing only an elder brother can do. He said to you, "Yeah, I can see why you'd like that."
Yes,
Now,
exactly.
when I read the book, I was
no.
thinking, what did Matt mean? What is the element that he sees?
I think he sees a book about a small-town suburban hero and about the glory of ordinariness and the glory of sort of middle Britishness, and a book that doesn't particularly spend a lot of time thinking about the nature of evil, but thinks about the nature of goodness and thinks
Yes, that's very true.
I think that.
Yes.
I've got a theory which I can't prove, but that he's writing this book at the end of his life, and it is a bit different, as you say.
Yeah.
There's no villains. There's no real plot other than is he going to get the diamonds or isn't he? And actually, the way he gets the diamonds is quite ingenious in the end. But as I say, after his brother, the second massive thing in his life is the working on the R100 airship.
Yeah.
And at the same time as the government are building another airship, the R101, and the R101 famously on its maiden kind of flight with the Minister of Air on board and 48 other people are killed. And this was obviously deeply traumatic to Shute because of the loss of life, but also because he felt somehow this idea of state-run enterprise versus private entrepreneurship, that's kind of completely then fixes his view about life. And my theory about this book is that it's a bit like the R100. It's a group of people all helping one another with minimal resources to achieve something that, when it all comes together, it comes together kind of beautifully.
I think, it's fascinating. It's his last book because what you get in this is Keith, a character who doesn't ask for much and doesn't get much, but is very exacting in what he does, is very precise in what he does things the right way if you're an engineer, and finds himself in a position where all of those things are suddenly recognised, understood, and all of those things pay off, and all of those things suddenly do bring him financial reward and all sorts of things. So I think it's saying, if you live your life the right way, if you live your life by the right measurements, and you're exacting and precise, then wouldn't it be lovely if that paid off? And it's sort of a fantasy.
Sort of fairy tale.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, here's the. I've got the first edition of this Trustee from the Toolroom here, and I will read you the jacket copy. Before I do that, do you write your own blurbs, Richard, or does the publisher write them for you?
The publishers write them, and then I
rewrite them.
I go into them and say, I wonder if we might not lead with that. I wonder if this might be slightly better for us.
Okay, so let's assume that perhaps. Well, we don't know, do we? We don't know if Nevil Shute will have signed this off or not.
He had a terrible problem with titles.
Tell me about it. This is a terrible title.
But he was always being told.
Trustee from the Toolroom. really think it's a terrible title.
He was always being told that his titles were shit.
Was he? Was he? By his
mean,
publishers?
And sometimes they won and sometimes he won. But I think
but the book still sold, didn't they? They
I
still
think On the
sold
Beach,
500,000 copies.
is it On the Beach or something's called The Legacy in America? Or
Okay, so this is the blurb from Trustee from the Toolroom.
two terrible nouns, Trustee and
I know.
Toolroom.
Keith Stewart's life resembled that of thousands of other Englishmen. He lived in Ealing, he was happily married, he worked hard for a small salary, he had a mortgage to pay off, and he was a contented man. In his house he had fixed up a model engineering workshop, and through his contributions to the miniature mechanic, he was known, as his Daily Post proved, to enthusiasts all over the world. Doesn't matter what way you approach this book.
Is this the blurb?
Yes.
Oh my
this is
God.
the blurb.
Who's picking this up?
Right, whoa.
Bring it on, come on.
One day, the tram lines of Keith Stewart's life were torn up. He woke up to find that he had become the trustee of his 10-year-old niece, and that he was committed to a wild quest for a cache which his own ingenuity had helped to hide.
Okay, that bit's good.
Yeah.
Suddenly, don't lead with that. Cut out the entire first paragraph.
I like.
Yeah.
We've never actually critiqued live as we
Yeah,
go.
yeah,
But all right,
yeah.
I'll throw you another bit. He began in deep waters
Ooh, okay.
on a
Bit of metaphor.
on a
Yeah,
2,000-mile voyage across the Pacific in a small yacht with one companion, and a very strange one at that. And he ended in high altitudes, among the top echelons of American big business.
There's a funny tense going on there,
Yeah.
isn't there? He started.
He
and then
began in
ended.
deep waters and he ended in high altitudes. It's not
Yeah.
elegant, is it? Keith Stewart's happiest discovery, apart from what he set out to find, so they're giving you the ending,
Yeah.
that's good, was that he had more friends in the world than he knew about.
Ah,
Oh, that's
Now,
nice.
wait. Nevil Shute's new book is on a theme dear to his heart. The ordeal of an ordinary man plunged into extraordinary circumstances and emerging with his personal values unshaken. Trustee from the Toolroom is a splendid story whose sense of adventure and the power of friendship make it the happiest as well as the last of Nevil,
wow.
Nevil Shute's novels.
Well, that is a sting in the tail.
I just want to say as well, on the back of this book are quotes from On the Beach, the very first of which, do you know this?
No, go on.
Okay, the first quote they've put on here from the Daily Telegraph is this: Nevil Shute's new novel is a quietly and deliberately terrible book. But by which they mean it's
yeah.
about a terrible subject. But
Those,
it's,
those
you know.
60s marketing departments,
Yeah.
how we love
But
it.
so I agree. It's. But here's the thing: what the blurb should say, nothing more except, public, you like Nevil Shute.
Yeah.
Here's
Yeah.
a book by him.
Oh, you're going to love it. But I'll just say it's because it is a splendid story.
Yeah.
That absolutely sums it up. I think it is a splendid story.
It is a splendid
and it
story.
is about the power of friendship.
Yeah.
And that's lovely. Let's leave it with that.
And his compulsive need to describe things in detail, but in a very, the language, you're never at sea. What was Fadiman saying about the lack of literary whatever? There's no filigree in this book at all.
Yeah.
He's a very,
Yeah.
I think he's a really marvellous writer.
Well, he's fascinating because he's very, very left-brained.
Yeah.
Right, very left-brained. But he obviously has extreme compassion for human beings as well, and it's quite a rare combination.
Yes.
So he writes within the constraints of the left brain, but he cannot help but let compassion into it.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many things he could have done differently in the book. I love the Jack Donnelly character, and that thing of him continually being fascinated by God, smallest in the world, the little tiny
Oh,
kind
yeah,
of
the
petrol
little
engine.
motor.
He just keeps, and
It's very interesting reading the reviews from the time of this book. They're mostly, they tend to damn with faint praise.
Yeah.
There's John, there's a fantastic review which I don't have, unfortunately. But if anyone goes online and you look up the Telegraph's review of Trustee from the Toolroom by Nevil Shute,
Right.
is done in a roundup with other fiction published the same week, alongside The Unnameable by Samuel Beckett.
no, God,
Which is one of the books we talked about on the last episode.
they were
How mad
exactly
is that?
contemporaneous.
If you had the fiction round at
Yeah.
that point, you could get Trustee from the Toolroom in the same week as Samuel Beckett and try and find some common ground between them. And he does.
Kindness.
He does.
Yeah.
He says, well, no, actually, John, he says, Nevil Shute does what Nevil Shute always did, which is give you detail, give you a belief in human beings.
Yeah.
And Samuel Beckett gives you a man who says he's going to go on and doesn't go on, but then he does go on.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it's like
there is in that slightly, as I say, that watching Keith Stewart kind of shambling down Ealing High Street. There is a sort of like a Beckettian tramp element to him. He just, all he's got is his, what did it say? His excellent values.
His excellent values. Now, we should say about Nevil Shute as well that Nevil was rather of the right.
Yes.
He's one of his novels, I've got a copy here, is called In the Wet. And this was published in 1954. It was published after Shute left the UK, emigrated for Australia because he was so appalled at the Clement Attlee government.
Getting in again.
It's not
he
a
said,
great look,
he
is
said,
it?
I will, if Attlee gets in again, I'm moving to Australia. He loved Australia.
The old sort of Andrew Lloyd Webber kind of thing of if they get in.
He was very cross about taxation.
Well, it's fascinating that a large part of the plot of this book is about
tax dodging.
Yeah, well, it's about not being able to take a lot of English money into foreign territory. And that's his sort of right. I'm gonna write a book about that. You always think, what's the inciting incident for a book?
Yeah.
Right. Whenever I read a book, you think, what was the idea? Where they can, okay, this is what I'm going to. Yeah. But I'm almost certain it's like, God, I wish I could have taken more money into Australia. How could I have done that? And then everything spins out.
And with, spoiler alert, but he gets away with it. So he keeps.
But then the Shute would say that it's
Stupid
a classic. It's a classic personal integrity versus bureaucratic idiocy.
Natural justice.
So, In the Wet, this novel that was published in 1953, shortly after he arrived in Australia, is. I don't know if either of you have read this.
No, I haven't.
Well, it
sounds like a follow-up to On the Beach. It sounds like you got off the beach and into the sea. Yeah.
It's a book about a man who, in the 19th century, is injured and is given opium as a palliative, and during an opium dream is transported forwards to the 1980s.
Oh, wow.
Where he discovers that Britain is, after a long period of austerity imposed by a socialist government, is on its knees.
Wow.
And so it's a kind of William Morris News from nowhere.
He loved William Morris.
But instead of going to the future and discovering it's a sort of workers' collective, it's the opposite. He goes and discovers that the workers' collective has ruined people. People don't like the Queen anymore in the Wet.
Okay.
It's really. But it's sort of, this is what I mean, Richard.
There's some unusual stuff he writes about.
Right, absolutely.
But he was born in 1899.
Yeah.
So his childhood was this extraordinary Edwardian kind of middle-class childhood. And then, you can see the war coming towards you. And beyond even the war, his dad was put in charge of the Irish Post Office in Dublin. And the young Nevil Shute is a stretcher bearer. He watches the Easter Rising, watches people soldiers being shot dead in front of him, and it distinguishes himself as a stretcher bearer. Very, very extraordinary breadth of experience for somebody from Ealing.
How the biographies of authors who were writing in the sort of early part of the last century are very different to the biography of authors now. It's, like no one's ever done anything. It's always and then worked in marketing for Procter & Gamble for 4 years before their first novel was published.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about lathes and workshops and Ealing, but the thing about Nevil Shute is, in all of the books of his that I've read, when he wants to, as it were, put his foot on the accelerator or take off, he can really do it.
Yeah, he really can.
He's a great writer of action.
The action sequence here.
Amazing.
So where are we at this point? We are.
So this is the brother-in-law and the wife are travelling to Vancouver, and they're travelling via various places. Just been to Tahiti, and by the way, so this is an action sequence. This follows about I'm going to say like a 10-page digression about how one navigates in a small craft across
You get
various
the full
oceans.
lesson,
You
right?
get the full thing, but actually quite interesting.
Amazing, yeah.
Absolutely.
But then, about the middle of the morning, something in the water ahead drew John's attention. He gave the helm to Joe is the wife, and stood up against the companion, the wind tearing at his clothing, lashed by the spray. Visibility was between 1 and 2 miles. There was something different half a mile or so ahead of him. The backs of the sea looked different in some way. Then, over to the left a little, in a quick passing glimpse, he saw what looked like the tops of palm trees above the waves. He turned with a heavy heart and went back to his wife. "There seems to be an island dead ahead," he shouted. "I think we're driving down onto a reef." She nodded. She was now past caring. He took her hand. "I'm sorry about this, Joe." She smiled at him. "It doesn't matter." "Can you take her a bit longer?" he asked. "I want to see if we can dodge it." She nodded, and he stood up again by the companion. It was clearer now, for they were closer. What he had seen were the backs of the great combers breaking on a coral reef. The line of different surf extended both on port and starboard hands as far as he could see. He searched desperately for a break in the surf, something to indicate a passage through the reef into the sheltered lagoon that might lie beyond. If there were any break, he would try and steer her off and run in through it, even though they might be overwhelmed in the process. He could see no break at all. It all just looked the same on either band as far as he could see. There was no escape for them now. Shearwater, that's the boat, was driving straight onto a coral reef in the Tutamos somewhere, and would leave her bones upon the coral, as many a tall ship had done before. He had not the remotest idea where they were. He came back to her and took the helm. In bad moments in the last 48 hours he had imagined this situation and had thought it out. Better to take the coral straight, head on, than to be thrown onto their beam ends, to have the hull crushed like an eggshell by the fury of the waves. Better to take it head on, taking the shock on the lead keel and trying to keep stern onto the seas. Reefs were seldom uniform in height. If they had the luck to strike a fissure, a patch where in calm water the coral was a couple of feet or more below the surface, they might possibly be driven over it onto the lagoon, and still float and live. He bent to explain this to his wife. "I want you to go below," he shouted. "When we strike, stay in the hull. She'll probably get full of water, but stay in the hull. Just keep your head above the water, but stay inside." She shouted, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to stay up here and steer her on. I'll join you down below as soon as she strikes. It's our best chance. I don't think she'll break up." "If she breaks up, she'll stay on the reef, won't she?" He knew what was in her mind. The keel will, and probably the frames. He paused and then leaned across and kissed her. "Now go below. I'm sorry I've got you into this." She kissed him in return. "It's not your fault." She stood up, waited her chance, opened the hatch and slipped down below, leaving it open for him to follow her. She sat down on one of the settees, the first aid box in her hands. There were now only a few minutes to go. She thought she ought to say a prayer, but it seemed mean to have neglected God and her religion for so long, and then to pray when death was imminent. The words would not come. She could only think of Janice. Janice, whose future happiness lay buried in the concrete beneath her feet. The concrete would survive upon the coral reef, but no one would ever know of it but Keith. Keith, who had never made much of his life. Keith, who had never been anywhere or done anything. Keith, to whose keeping she had trusted Janice. From the cockpit, John Dermot shouted above the screaming of the wind, "Next one, Joe!" In those last moments, the power of prayer came to her, and she muttered in the accents of her childhood, "Lord, give Keith a bit of good sense." Then they struck.
It's brilliant.
Master storyteller. That's
He
what I'm
is.
saying.
He's not mucking about.
I think one of the things about that, Richard, actually, that occurred to me while you were reading, it was wonderful, by the way. The thing about Nevil Shute's novels, and something that has in common with your novels, is people die.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are stakes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
So we've talked about it being quite whimsical, but actually, if you look at a town like Alice, that's a novel of the barbarity of man to man, woman to man, man to child. Trustee from the Toolroom, it kills them off there in a kind of methodical way.
Well,
right? On the beach, everybody dies.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But the thing, and honestly, the thing about it is, and I think this a lot when I'm writing, he talks about it, but he doesn't bang on about it.
No.
You know, it doesn't kind of, you know, he sort of writes about it, and then he'll write about the lathe, and he'll write about them in the same measured tone, because that's how life is.
And that's one of the great things about a town like Alice, I think, because the suffering of the women, which is,
Yeah.
you know, half of them die. It's
Rereading A Town Like Alice.
yes.
the child dies when it's bitten by a snake. And I remember reading that thinking, but they'll suck the venom out. They don't.
Didn't work.
Yeah.
Or rather, if they do, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So as you say, Richard, the idea that life can end suddenly, like an exploding airship, say, which, there is that sense that having lived through wars or disasters or conflict,
losing a brother very early on.
The story goes on.
I just feel a couple of things about the Tory thing, definitely, but he is it's the old school small. It's the old fashioned kind of one nation Tory thing.
Yeah. He likes an entrepreneur.
And he likes a bit of swashbuckle. He likes a bit of risk taking. He's not. But I think he is, and also, you think about this book. He gets some jip about his women characters, but actually in all the books, in this book, Katie the wife is actually the one who does all the accounts and does the work, and even in the kind of representation of there are two important Jewish characters in the book.
Absolutely,
Jack Donnelly is half Polynesian and gets the girl.
Yeah, I mean I've just been reading a lot of Golden Age crime for a thing, and I was slightly worried reading this book, but actually for the day, it's not.
It's extraordinary.
Terrible. Yeah. Can I read a Betjeman quote about Nevil Shute, which it goes to this sort of Toriness of it. I always say you try and judge people by their motives, not by their opinions, and so that's
very good.
So Betjeman concluded, Nevil Shute does not sound priggish or false because he is obviously sincere. He is not a self-styled plain man with loud, dull opinions. He is humbler than that. He writes because he wants to give us hope. He does not write literature, but I think he succeeds in his mission.
That's
we'll take that as well, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Could we let's hear another clip quickly from this is his daughter Heather again talking about her father, and you'll also hear Adam Hart Davis. This is from an episode of Great Lives on Radio 4 about 20 years ago.
In the evening after dinner, he would go into his little workshop and he would build little engines and things like that. And, of course, all that came out in Trustee from the Toolroom, which was the last book that he wrote.
That's fascinating because that's my favourite of all his books. I read that a couple of weeks ago and it's absolutely wonderful. And I noticed that Keith Stewart, his hero, lived in Ealing, and obviously it was very autobiographical. And he describes him as a little man, rather quiet, insignificant, with a greasy raincoat. It's the most charming book of all, I think. And I hadn't realised that your father was a miniature mechanic.
He needed all these different things as a sort of a counterpoint to one another. He never, except perhaps at the very end, did he consider himself a writer. He considered himself an engineer most of his life.
Now, we should also say one of the things that this quiet, unassuming, quirky, individual engineering man was, by some margin, one of the best-selling writers of the 20th century. Yeah. And after he died, Trustee from the Toolroom was published 2-3 months after he died. And at the time, it was a world record for a first printing in the UK. Wow. They printed 200,000 copies immediately of the first edition. As we said earlier, the Sunday Times bestseller list was in the New York Times for 5 months. So the question I want to circle back to before we wrap up, why hasn't Nevil Shute, I think it is fair to say, why isn't he read now?
Yeah, I think it's deeply unfashionable. Certainly in literary terms, because what he's doing, as you say, it's splendid and it's charming.
But as you said, as Betjeman just said, it's not literature, but what it is has its own merits, right?
Exactly, and it feels to me like he's right. Listen, that's what this podcast is all about. It's saying he's gone out of fashion, but he shouldn't have done, because there is incredible merit in this book. I can imagine reading this book and coming at it from a different angle to I did and not enjoying it. And kind of going, nothing happens here. But I think if you come at it head on, I think it's an extraordinary work. And I think if you look at everything that's happened since Nevil Shute died in terms of, the literature that sort of was big, the authors who were big, of course he disappeared, because what does he have to offer, the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the noughties. But we're in the 2020s now, and the world we're living in feels to me like this book has an awful lot to offer us when it talks about just doing things the right way, and it talks about getting rewarded, and it talks about the value of friendship and the value of people supporting each other. Feels to me like that's not a story we've needed for the last 30 or 40 years, but probably a story we need now.
I think that's very wise. I'll also add something else, which has been one of the great pleasures of making this podcast, is every so often we chance upon an author or a novel where I think, and I do think Nevil Shute is one of these, John, I'm absolutely enraptured by how weird these books are.
Yeah,
I think
weird.
These were some of the best-selling novels
Yeah.
of the 20th century. Each one is so different from the previous one. Each one is so peculiar in its storytelling method and its subject matter.
He is his own genre, right? So I was thinking of who I have so many men thinking of, my grandfather, my uncles, men who did things in sheds, who were interested in machines. Yeah. These books were kind of written, I mean, whether they were written for them, they're certainly read by them in their millions. I wonder, where did that market go? Where did those men, Le Carre maybe, Len Dayton, but they're much more, in a way, they're much more generic. I mean, well, I think Le Carre is a great writer, but, it's like there's no one really, after Nevil Shute, who writes Nevil Shute.
You know where they've all
novels.
gone, don't you? They've all got podcasts now.
Yeah.
They're all making YouTube videos. Yeah.
Speaking of which, you'll be able to see this on YouTube. We've filmed it and everything, so you can see me and John surrounded by our phones and our notes.
Wearing
and our
a tie.
Wearing a tie, look. It's nice.
Anyway, all good things come to an end. We're towing this little bicentennial bark into a harbour. Huge thank you to Richard.
Thank you.
For enrolling us in the International Alliance of Shutists, and to Nicky Birch for navigating our little ketch across the wide Shutian Ocean.
If you want show notes with clips, links and suggestions for further reading for this show and the 199 that we've already recorded, please visit our website at backlisted.fm, where you'll also find a link to our regular newsletter, which will include things that pigs that John Mitchinson has met, some places in Purley that I recommend, and books perhaps that Richard Osman has been reading. And if you want to buy any of the books, including Richard's and Nevil's, please visit our bookshop at bookshop.org and choose Backlisted as your bookshop. We're still keen to hear from you on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and Blue Sky. And furthermore, we will be recording a live episode of Backlisted at the Woodstock Poetry Festival in Oxford on Saturday, December the 2nd. It's the Saturday.
It's 8 p.m. in the evening, St Mary's Church, Woodstock, and the subject of the podcast is
Basil Bunting's extraordinary poem, Brig Flats.
No engineering in it, but it's like The Wasteland, only up north. We have the great Neil Astley from Blood Axe as guest, and the other guest is McGillivray, a.k.a. Kirsten Norrie, who's a Blood Axe poet. Go on to the woodstockpoetryfestival.org website and you can buy tickets, and we look forward to seeing you there.
I like to think Nevil Shute and Basil Bunting did meet at one point. What a thought.
Yeah. I mean, you can imagine Neville taking out one of his little engines and Basil Bunting becoming quite fascinated by it.
Not the Nevil Shute.
Right. If you want to hear Backlisted early and ad-free, you can subscribe to our Patreon, www.patreon.com/backlisted. Your subscription brings other benefits. If you subscribe at the lot listener level, or for rather less than the price of a monthly subscription to Miniature Mechanic, you'll get not one but two exclusive extra podcasts every month. We call it Locklisted because it began in the Wenlock Tavern just before lockdown, and it features the three of us talking and recommending the books, films and music we've enjoyed the previous fortnight. For those of you who enjoyed our What Have You Been Reading slot, that's where you'll now find it. Plus, Lot listeners get their names read out, accompanied by lashings of thanks and gratitude.
And because it's episode 200, our guest has agreed on the spot to read out these names. Take it away, Richard.
I might get some of these pronunciations wrong.
Don't worry.
Diane Sabina.
Thank you.
Bear Bramini.
Thank you.
Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
That I can do. Camilla Wilde.
Thanks,
John
Miller.
Ward.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ian Farr.
Great.
Liz.
Oh, Liz.
Liz.
Thank you, Liz.
Ada Arduini.
Thank
Yep.
you.
Christine L. Boatman.
Thank you.
Oh,
Very
a
good
shoot
name for
name.
this.
Yes.
Very
Best name
good.
so far for a novelist. And Janine Nickel.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, everybody. Richard, before we go, is there anything we haven't covered about Nevil Shute or Trustee from the Toolroom or anything that you would like to add?
No, other than I stumbled across this novel and it just made 2 weeks absolutely fly by. And that's the point of this podcast. It's why I'm here. It's lovely to be here. But anyone who reads it, I hope that you love it.
Thank you so much. Well, thanks for joining us today. And thanks, everyone, particularly if this is the 200th episode you've heard, or the first. Either way, thank you so much.
Everyone welcome.
And should we do it again in a fortnight?
Why don't we? Let's
All
do
right,
it again in a
great.
fortnight.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for
Bye,
listening.
everyone.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.